March 17, 1944, New Britain Island, South Pacific, 0430 hours. Private First Class. Daniel Forrester of the 1st Marine Division pressed his back against the slick mud of the foxhole as rain hammered down through the jungle canopy. 3 days since their last supply drop. 3 days of pushing inland through terrain that swallowed men whole. The Japanese defenders had withdrawn deeper into the interior, but they'd left something worse behind. Hunger. Forrester's stomach contracted with a sharp pain that had nothing to do with enemy fire. He fumbled in his pack for the last of his K-rations, the waxed cardboard box now soggy, its contents reduced to a small chocolate bar and a packet of powdered coffee. Around him, 23 men from Charlie Company shared the same predicament. Their advance had outpaced their supply lines, and the monsoon rains had prevented airdrops for the past 72 hours. Lieutenant Warren Cooper slid down beside Forrester, his face gaunt in the pre-dawn darkness. Scout report just came in. Japanese defensive position 2 clicks ahead. Battalion wants us moving in 30 minutes. Sir, the men haven't eaten a proper meal in days, Forrester whispered. Cooper nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter where Marines huddled in shallow fighting positions. I know. And intelligence says we've got at least 5 more days of combat operations before we link up with supply elements. The rain intensified, drumming against helmets and plastering uniforms to skin. Through the downpour, Forrester could make out the shadow of Sergeant Matsuda, a Nisei intelligence specialist attached to their company. He was examining something pulled from an abandoned Japanese position they'd overrun the previous day. "What's he got?" Forrester asked. Cooper's voice was flat. "Their version of field rations. We found a cache in that last bunker." "Japanese food!" Forrester's stomach growled involuntarily. "Yeah," Cooper said, "but only a fool eats that raw." The company would learn just how wrong that assessment was before the week was through. The Pacific Theater presented logistical challenges unlike any other in the Second World War. While the European front operated with relatively stable supply lines, Marines and Army units fighting across the Pacific faced an environment actively hostile to conventional logistics. The Type 1 landing ship that had delivered Charlie Company to New Britain could only carry enough food supplies for the initial assault phase. After that, the men depended on naval resupply, airdrops, or whatever they could scavenge. Standard issue for each Marine was the K-ration, 3 small boxed meals providing approximately 3,000 calories daily. Designed as an emergency combat ration, the K-ration was never intended for extended use. Yet in the Pacific, units frequently subsisted on them for weeks. By 1944, combat fatigue from malnutrition had become as dangerous as enemy bullets. Sergeant James Matsuda understood this better than most. Born to Japanese immigrants in California, he had volunteered despite his family being relocated to internment camps. His linguistic skills made him invaluable to intelligence operations, but his cultural knowledge remained largely untapped. "The problem isn't just quantity," Matsuda explained to Lieutenant Cooper as they crouched in the command post, a slightly larger hole in the ground covered with poncho liners. "It's the wrong kind of calories for jungle fighting. Men are burning through energy faster than K-rations can replace it." Cooper unfolded a map protected by a clear plastic cover. Pencil markings showed their planned 5-day advance through terrain the Japanese defenders knew intimately. "We've got 2 options," he said. "Halt the advance and wait for resupply, or continue with what we have." Battalion's orders permitted no delays. The strategic window for securing the airfield at Cape Gloucester narrowed with each passing hour. Around them, Marines cleaned weapons and tried to ignore the persistent ache of hunger. The fatal flaw in American jungle warfare doctrine was its dependence on supply lines designed for European theaters. The M29 Weasel cargo carrier meant to navigate difficult terrain, routinely bogged down in New Britain's muddy interior. Airdrops required weather clearances that rarely materialized during monsoon season. The hard reality settled over Charlie Company. They would need to complete their mission on empty stomachs. That evening, as Marines attempted to heat their remaining rations with small tablet stoves that sputtered in the damp air, Sergeant Matsuda approached Lieutenant Cooper again. In his hands was a small cloth bag recovered from the abandoned Japanese position. "Sir," Matsuda said quietly, "I believe I've found a solution, but it requires the men to reconsider what constitutes food in a combat zone." Cooper looked at the bag skeptically. "The men won't eat enemy rations, Sergeant. They've been warned about poisoning." "Not poisoning, sir," Matsuda replied. "Cultural ignorance. What we've been throwing away might be the difference between completing this mission or failing from exhaustion." The Japanese soldier's combat load differed fundamentally from his American counterpart in one critical respect: portable nourishment adapted to jungle conditions. What Charlie Company had been discarding as inedible was in fact a sophisticated emergency feeding system developed over decades of Imperial Japanese Army operations in harsh environments. In the dim light of a sheltered radio position, Sergeant Matsuda emptied the contents of the cloth bag onto a poncho spread flat on the ground. Lieutenant Cooper and PFC Forrester watched with increasing interest as Matsuda arranged the items methodically. "This is kanpan," Matsuda explained, holding up a hard biscuit similar in appearance to hardtack, but sealed in waxed paper. "And this," he continued, removing a small can, "contains sakura niku, preserved meat mixed with rice." More items followed: small packets of dehydrated miso soup, rice crackers infused with fish oil, and dried plums called umeboshi. Most intriguing was a cloth-wrapped package containing small, dark, gelatinous blocks. What Marines have been calling Japanese candy is actually concentrated field rations, Matsuda said. The energy food designed specifically for combat in humid environments. Cooper's skepticism was evident. "How do we know it's safe? Command briefings specifically warned against consuming enemy supplies." Matsuda chose his next words carefully. "Sir, those warnings were based on assumptions, not analysis. I grew up eating variations of these foods. The preservation methods used, salt, fermentation, dehydration, actually make them safer than our own perishable rations in these conditions." The risk was significant. Military regulations explicitly prohibited consuming captured enemy provisions without quartermaster clearance. If men fell ill, Cooper would face court-martial. If they continued without adequate nutrition, the mission would likely fail regardless. "I can demonstrate," Matsuda offered. He took one of the dark blocks, broke off a section, and consumed it without hesitation. "What is that exactly?" Forrester asked, watching closely. "Kori tofu, freeze-dried bean curd, lightweight protein that reconstitutes with water, even unfiltered water. Japanese soldiers can carry 2 weeks' nutrition in a space smaller than one of our K-ration boxes." Cooper weighed the options silently. Battalion expected results, not excuses. The next morning would bring another attack, and his men needed strength. "Show me how to prepare it properly," Cooper finally said. "We'll test it with volunteers first." As rain continued its relentless percussion on the jungle canopy, Matsuda methodically demonstrated how to reconstitute the Japanese rations using minimal water and heat. The process was precise. Certain elements were meant to be consumed without preparation. Others required specific rehydration techniques. Most importantly, the entire system was designed to provide maximum caloric intake with minimal weight and cooking requirements. The key difference, Matsuda explained as he stirred a small pot of reconstituting rice, is philosophy. American rations try to approximate home cooking. Japanese rations accept that field nutrition is different from civilian eating. By midnight, a small group including Cooper, Forrester, and 3 volunteer Marines had consumed carefully prepared portions of the captured supplies. They waited tensely for any adverse reactions. None came. Instead, something unexpected happened. The gnawing emptiness that had plagued them for days began to subside. The decision now fell to Lieutenant Cooper: maintain regulatory compliance and watch his men weaken, or embrace an unorthodox solution that violated standing orders but might salvage both the mission and his men. "If anyone asks," Cooper finally said, "we're field testing captured equipment for intelligence purposes." Dawn broke on March 18th with the sound of distant artillery. American 105mm howitzers beginning their preparatory barrage against Japanese positions blocking the route to Cape Gloucester. Charlie Company needed to advance 6 kilometers through heavily contested jungle to secure a strategic ridgeline by nightfall. Lieutenant Cooper gathered his squad leaders in the grey morning light. Each man looked hollow-eyed from days of insufficient rations. Without preamble, Cooper gestured to Sergeant Matsuda, who distributed small packages to each squad leader. "Nutritional intelligence gathering," Cooper stated flatly. "Each squad will test and document the effectiveness of these captured supplies. Sergeant Matsuda will demonstrate proper preparation. Mission parameters remain unchanged." The reactions ranged from disgust to desperate curiosity. Staff Sergeant Miller, leading 2nd Squad, examined the unfamiliar items with open suspicion. "With respect, sir, my men won't eat Jap food," Miller said. "Your men will follow orders," Cooper replied evenly, "or they'll complete this mission on empty stomachs. Your choice, Sergeant." PFC Forrester, now designated as Matsuda's assistant, moved among the squads demonstrating the precise preparation methods. The kanpan hardtack could be eaten dry or softened with water. The umeboshi, preserved plums, startlingly sour, contained salt and natural preservatives that helped prevent dehydration. Most important were the concentrated rice balls wrapped in dried seaweed, onigiri, providing sustained energy in a compact form. At 0700 hours, Charlie Company moved out. The terrain was brutal, steep, muddy inclines, dense vegetation that reduced visibility to meters, and the constant threat of ambush. Under normal circumstances, each Marine burned far more calories than K rations could replace. The first test of Matsuda's solution would come within hours. 3 kilometers into the advance, Charlie Company encountered the first Japanese defensive position, a reinforced bunker with interlocking fields of fire from 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns. Previous operations had shown that neutralizing such positions required sustained effort from Marines operating at peak physical condition. Cooper deployed his platoons in a flanking maneuver that required 1st Squad to make a grueling circular approach through particularly dense jungle. Led by Sergeant Peterson, 1st Squad had been among the most skeptical of the Japanese rations, but had consumed them as ordered. The assault that followed was methodical and effective. Despite the challenging terrain, Peterson's men maintained their energy levels throughout the 60-minute operation. The difference was subtle but crucial. Where previously Marines had fatigued quickly in the humid conditions, the complex carbohydrates and proteins of the Japanese field rations provided more sustained energy release. By mid-afternoon, Charlie Company had overcome 3 defensive positions and advanced 5 kilometers, their most efficient progress since landing on New Britain. The cost was 3 wounded, but none from combat exhaustion, a significant improvement over previous engagements. As Marines secured their night defensive positions along the strategic ridgeline, accomplishing their objective ahead of schedule, the initial skepticism toward the Japanese rations had transformed into cautious appreciation. Staff Sergeant Miller, the most vocal critic, approached Cooper as evening security was established. "Sir," Miller said quietly, "request permission to access more of those Japanese supplies for my squad." Cooper nodded. "Matsuda is organizing distribution now. Thoughts on effectiveness?" Miller hesitated, professional pride warring with practical reality. "Different," he finally admitted, "but it keeps the men moving. Davis carried the bar all day without switching out once. That hasn't happened since we landed. Throughout the perimeter, similar scenes played out as Marines who had just days earlier mocked the strange Jap food now carefully followed Matsuda's preparation instructions. The umeboshi plums, initially considered too sour to consume, became prized for their ability to combat the fatigue of prolonged exertion. That night, as tropical rain resumed its steady rhythm on the jungle canopy, Charlie Company had accomplished something remarkable. They had completed a demanding combat mission while operating beyond their supply lines, by adapting the very enemy innovations they had previously dismissed. The real test, however, would come the following day, when battalion headquarters learned of Cooper's unorthodox solution. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hanson, commanding officer of 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, was known throughout the division as a rigid disciplinarian with unwavering adherence to regulations. When Charlie Company reached the rendezvous point at Cape Gloucester on March 21st, 2 days ahead of schedule and with significantly fewer cases of combat exhaustion than other companies, Hanson immediately demanded an explanation. Lieutenant Cooper stood at attention in the battalion command post, a captured Japanese schoolhouse now serving as headquarters. He delivered his report without embellishment, detailing the nutritional crisis, Sergeant Matsuda's solution, and the subsequent tactical advantages gained. You deliberately violated Standing Order Pacific 42B, prohibiting consumption of captured enemy provisions, Hanson stated, his voice dangerously calm. That's grounds for immediate relief of command, Lieutenant. Yes, sir, Cooper acknowledged. I made a tactical decision to preserve combat effectiveness. What followed wasn't the expected reprimand, but rather an unusual request. Colonel Lewis Jordan, the regimental commander who had unexpectedly joined the debriefing, leaned forward with interest. This Sergeant Matsuda, I want a complete report on these Japanese rations, composition, caloric value, weight-to-energy ratio, preservation methods, everything. And I want comparative analysis with our K rations. Within 24 hours, Sergeant Matsuda found himself reassigned to Divisional G4, Logistics, where he began a comprehensive study of Japanese field nutrition systems. His initial findings were illuminating. The average Japanese soldier carried rations that weighed 60% less than American equivalents, while providing comparable caloric intake and superior preservation in tropical conditions. By April 1944, the practical implications of Charlie Company's improvisation had reached beyond the 1st Marine Division. A classified memorandum circulated among Pacific Theater commanders titled Adaptive Field Nutrition, Lessons from Enemy Subsistence Systems. While military regulations prohibited officially adopting enemy ration components, the document outlined theoretical improvements to American field feeding that bore striking resemblance to the Japanese techniques. For the men of Charlie Company, the experience transformed their understanding of survival in the Pacific Theater. Marines who had once mocked Japanese soldiers as physically inferior developed a reluctant respect for the practical innovations their enemy had developed. Cultural assumptions gave way to combat pragmatism. The K-ration remained standard issue throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign, but unofficial adaptation became increasingly common among veteran units. Concentrated rice balls wrapped in dried seaweed appeared in marine packs from Peleliu to Okinawa, never officially sanctioned, but tacitly permitted by commanders who prioritized combat effectiveness over regulatory compliance. Sergeant James Matsuda received the Bronze Star for his intelligence contributions, though the citation carefully omitted specific references to the ration innovation. After the war, he used his expertise to help develop compact, lightweight field nutrition systems for the restructured Marine Corps, incorporating lessons from both American and Japanese approaches. Lieutenant Cooper neither received punishment nor recognition for his decision. When questioned about it years later at a company reunion, he simply remarked that hunger makes for poor tactics and worse decisions. The pragmatic adaptation he authorized, officially designated Field Expedient Nutrition Study, New Britain Campaign, was quietly incorporated into special operations training by 1950. In the official combat history of the 1st Marine Division, the New Britain Campaign merits only 3 paragraphs, noting significant logistical challenges overcome through tactical adaptation. The specifics of how a company of hungry Marines learned to respect enemy innovation remain largely footnotes to the broader Pacific narrative. But among veterans who served in Charlie Company, a common phrase emerged when facing seemingly insurmountable challenges in later civilian life. "Only a fool eats that raw," now transformed from ignorant mockery to a wry reminder that sometimes survival requires setting aside prejudice and learning from the very adversary you've been taught to dismiss. United States Marine Corps Historical Division, Operational Feeding Report, Pacific Theater, 1946. The capacity for adaptive nutrition under combat conditions proved a significant force multiplier in environments where conventional supply chains proved inadequate. Cultural resistance to unfamiliar feeding systems represented a more significant obstacle than logistical limitations.